Under the advice of my attorneys, I will invoke my right under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution to refrain from answering your questions. Thank you.
There was a hard-working mom living in Ohio during the very height and depth of the global coronavirus pandemic. She decided to go to her son's high school football game. They hadn't been out much. The kids had been learning at school, and then the school got shut down. They hadn't really gotten much out of that education. As any parent knew, that remote learning was no learning at all. But it was a Friday night. Her son wanted to go watch a buddy play football, so they went to the stadium. They sat alone, far from everybody else, just a mom, a dad, and a few kids. They didn't feel they needed to wear masks because it was stupid since they were outside. They all live together. They're not near anybody. Dr. Fauci, do you know what happened to that mom and that family? That's a question.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
They were forcibly dragged out of that massive stadium and were immediately placed under arrest by the authorities. What day of the week is it today?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color tie are you at?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. I am very happy to testify before any congressional oversight committee. I have nothing to hide. I can explain and validate everything that I've done. So the answer is, if there are oversight hearings, I absolutely will cooperate fully and testify before the Congress if asked. You may not know, but I've testified before Congress a few hundred times, okay, over the last 40 years or so. So I have no trouble testifying. We can defend and explain and stand by everything that we've said. So I have nothing to hide. Under the advice of my attorneys, I will invoke my right under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution to refrain from answering your questions. Thank you.
Friends, during the COVID-19 pandemic, he appeared at the White House press briefings almost every day. And that very Anthony Fauci, who is hailed as the conscience of American science, is back in the spotlight again. Yesterday at the Senate hearing, he acted like an AI that couldn't understand human language, repeating the same thing 111 times. Why did he do that? Today's content's really exciting. But to really understand this scene, we first have to go back to last weekend. Saturday, July 26th, Senator Rand Paul, who is also the current chairman of the Homeland Security Committee, suddenly posted over 1,000 pages of documents on his social media. These are Fauci's personal diaries, written from December 2019 all the way through December 2022, covering the entire COVID-19 pandemic. Why did a senator manage to get hold of Fauci's personal diaries? Because these diaries weren't written by hand in a notebook at home, but were typed on a government-issued computer. They were saved on a federal server. According to reports from the U.S. media, Fauci was very likely gathering real-time material for his memoir, On Call, which was published in 2024. In other words, he was using a government-issued computer during work hours to draft what would become a best-selling book for the latter part of his life. That's why his diary ended up in the official system. So Congress's request to access it is completely legal. So strictly speaking, these diaries weren't stolen, they were dug up. Later, Congressman Paul added another batch of 465 pages as a prequel, which are Fauci's email records from 2001 to 2015. So what kind of mind-blowing secrets are hidden in these nearly 1,600 pages of documents? The most shocking part is about the virus's origin, the pandemic prevention rules, and other major issues related to the outbreak, and the two-faced masks he wore both in public and behind the scenes. Let's start with the origin of the virus. What we see on the surface, starting from April 17, 2020, Fauci began to repeatedly and publicly cite a paper called The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, firmly telling the entire American public that the virus was naturally occurring and that it spread from animals to humans. On May 4th of that year, he once again told National Geographic that the evidence indicates it wasn't man-made or engineered. From then on, for a full 4 years, the lab leak theory became taboo, and anyone mentioning it could be labeled a conspiracy theorist at any time, or even accused of racism or hate speech. However, if you open up his personal diary, you'll discover a completely different world. As early as January 26, 2020, just 3 days after Wuhan went into lockdown, while the whole world was still waiting for official news from the Chinese Communist Party, and even Trump hadn't decided whether to suspend flights between China and the US, Fauci had already written this in his diary. Based on epidemiological data and genetic data, the first infected person appeared in early December 2019 and had no connection to that Hunan seafood market. Now, we know that market wasn't the origin, it was just an amplifier. Pay attention. At this point, Wuhan had only been locked down for 3 days. Fauci had already overturned the official narrative that the seafood market was the source. So why did he later endorse the Chinese Communist Party? Let's keep watching. 6 days later, on February 1st, 2020, Fauci urgently convened a conference call with 12 top scientists. After the meeting, he clearly noted in his diary that the vast majority of the 12 scientists believe that the virus's furin cleavage site, a key structure that determines whether the virus can infect human cells, had never been observed in bat viruses in nature. This statement is extremely important. How shall we understand it? In the second half of this episode, we go into detail about this. If you missed it after watching today's episode, feel free to check it out. Simply put, among all the known coronaviruses that are genetically similar to the novel coronavirus, none of them have the SARS-CoV-2 furin cleavage site. And this cleavage site is the key structure that determines whether the virus can infect humans. However, the novel coronavirus that caused millions of deaths worldwide in 2020 has a furin cleavage site precisely at the S1-S2 junction of its spike protein. In other words, the 12 scientists generally believe that the type of coronavirus that spread in 2020 does not exist in nature. So here's the question. Where did the virus come from? As we discussed in this episode, 21 months before the massive outbreak of the virus, Peter Daszak, who was the head of EcoHealth Alliance funded by Fauci's NIAID, submitted a research proposal called DEFUSE to the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, DARPA, of the U.S. Department of Defense. The plan specifically aimed to artificially insert a furin cleavage site into a laboratory coronavirus. The participants were Daszak, Barrick, and Shezheng Li. Connecting these two threads, friends, do you feel the suffocating sense behind all this? Next, something bizarre happened. Right after the meeting on February 1st ended, on February 4th, 4 scientists who attended the meeting, led by Anderson, suddenly made a complete 180-degree turn in their stance. They overturned their previous doubts and asserted that the lab origin theory was scientifically unreliable. They even began drafting what would later become the globally influential proximal origin paper on SARS-CoV-2. So what exactly happened during this time? Why did the scientists reach a completely opposite conclusion in just 3 days? That doesn't seem very scientific, does it? Let's take a look at the email records of those involved. On February 12, 2020, in an email submitting to Nature, Anderson personally wrote this line, prompted by Jeremy Farrar, Anthony Fauci, Francis Collins, and others. So in the email, he personally admitted that this paper was prompted and pushed by Fauci, Collins, and Farrar. So behind the complete turnaround from a lab leak is possible to a lab leak is not credible stood 3 people, Fauci, then NIH Director Collins, and Farrar. But our story doesn't end here. This paper was initially rejected by Nature. Why was that? Anderson personally admitted during his testimony in the House that the reason the Nature editorial team rejected the paper was because it leaned too heavily toward the lab origin theory. In other words, in the original version of the paper, the authors actually left room for the lab leak theory. Not only did they not completely rule it out, but Nature even thought the paper leaned too much in that direction. After the paper was rejected by Nature, the authors revised it and strengthened the parts opposing the lab leak theory. As a result, a month and a half later, the paper was published. Fauci sent Anderson an email saying the paper was well written. 2 months later, the NIAID, headed by Fauci, approved a grant of up to $8.9 million for Anderson. Right after finishing the paper, a huge sum of money landed in their pocket. If you tell me there's no connection, I just don't buy it. Friends, do you believe it? If you don't believe it either, give me a like to let me know. It only took 3 days for the possibility of a lab leak, which was initially considered likely by 12 top scientists, to be dismissed as completely implausible. Add a custom-made paper, and in the end, an $8,900,000 reward. This isn't science, this is quality control. If the origins issue is at least dressed up academically, then the pandemic prevention rules exposed in the diary are nothing short of an absurd farce. During the pandemic, the 2 words that left the deepest impression on us were mask and 6 feet of social distancing. But do you know where they actually came from? On the surface, on March 8, 2020, Fauci said on CBS's 60 Minutes that people were walking around everywhere wearing masks and that it was useless. But just 2 months later, his attitude changed dramatically, and he started urging everyone to wear a mask. Why was that? Was it because science discovered new data about mask protection? No. In an internal email, when discussing mask policies, Fauci wrote that we should slightly revise what we previously said about masks. Just look outside. Everyone's wearing them anyway, so we should stay consistent with them. So it turns out that since everyone is wearing them, masks just became a must. Is this science? This is just following the crowd. And then there's the 6-foot social distancing rule that caused countless restaurants to close and schools to shut down. In January 2024, Fauci admitted in closed-door testimony before the House that it just came about like that. I don't remember any discussion about whether it should be 5 feet or 6 feet. It was an empirical decision, not backed by data. See, a rule that affected the lives of hundreds of millions of people just came about like that. Regarding lockdowns, during the pandemic, Fauci repeatedly told the public that he never ordered schools, bars, or restaurants to close. That was all decided by local officials and had nothing to do with him. But in his diary, it says that on March 15, 2020, he called New York City Mayor Bill de Blasio and told him that all bars and restaurants in New York City should be closed. On March 20th, de Blasio asked him whether the whole city should go into lockdown, and Fauci replied, just go ahead and do it. In November, an official from Los Angeles County made an urgent call, and the diary notes that over the past few months, he had already called me several times for advice. And every time, Fauci advised them to impose lockdowns. Look here, I think now you should be able to understand why Senator Paul says that the COVID lockdowns were forced upon all Americans, because you, Fauci, personally planned and personally helped commit this crime. In over 1,000 pages of diaries, there are also records of Fauci complaining about Trump. He wrote that Trump's press conferences were sloppy, rambling, and completely out of control, saying that Trump was spouting nonsense on the campaign trail and even insulted Senator Paul by calling him a freak. He also documented his own satisfaction and obsession with his sudden fame during the pandemic. He wrote that the Washington Post ran a big front-page article about him, saying he was very likable and that his reputation was exploding both at home and abroad. To put it bluntly, today I am the most famous and talked about person in America and one of the most recognizable people in the world. His pride practically jumps off the page. When he was indulging in self-admiration in his diary, he never could have imagined that one day these diaries would become a boomerang that would destroy him. Senate Homeland Security Committee Chairman Paul immediately summoned Fauci to a hearing because of these diaries, which led to the shocking scene we saw at the beginning.
Now let's look at 2 other communications. You emailed Dave Moranz on January 26, 2020. Quote, "It is important that I speak with you tonight. Please call me at home." This is a part of Exhibit 2 that you have in front of you. This email is sent the same day, the exact same day you're writing an internal document. Quote, "Now we know the market was not the source. It was the amplifier." Unquote. Would you call the origins of COVID-19 a substantive issue?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Did you discuss COVID-19 origins with Dave Moranz on this phone call?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Now let's take a closer look at the last time you testified before Congress. This is part of what you have in front of you, Exhibit 4, which is part of the record. In June 2024, you testified that Dr. Moran's, quote, was not an advisor to me on institute policy or other substantive issues. Furthermore, his office is located in a different building from that of the NIAID director, unquote. Is that still your testimony today?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
So today, under oath, your testimony remains that Dr. Moran's was not an advisor to you on institute policy or substantive matters.
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
I've got Exhibit 5, which you have in front of you. On October 24th, 2021, David Moran's texted you to provide information about an advocate for the controversial EcoHealth Alliance grant. You thanked him and told him that you would check the information. Would you agree that this shows an advisory relationship between David Moran's and yourself?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Would you agree that you two were discussing a substantive issue?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
In this 2-minute video segment, Fauci said 7 times, on the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution. Friends, if you didn't watch the live stream and just happened to come across a video like this, you might wonder if it's AI generated. It's hard to believe it's real. But not only is this real, Fauci didn't just say it 7 times. For almost every question, his answer was always the same. He invoked his Fifth Amendment right to refuse to answer a total of 111 times. Why did this happen? How did Fauci dare to play games with the Senate like this? And what's the deal with Senator Hawley questioning whether you even have the right to invoke the Fifth Amendment? So how will this incident develop next? Now, let me explain the constitutional and legal battle behind all this so you can not only enjoy the drama, but also truly understand what's going on. But before we get into that, I want to ask you all, do you think Fauci is refusing to answer because he has something to hide, that he must be involved somehow? If you think that's the case, type an A for me. If you think he's just being legally cautious and afraid of saying something wrong, type a B. Let's see what every single person here thinks. Here, Fauci invoked the Fifth Amendment. The original text of the Constitution says, no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. In plain language, it means you can't be forced to testify against yourself to prove you're guilty. The origin of this law was to prevent the government from doing what they did in ancient times, arresting you, forcing you to confess, and then using your confession to convict you. This is the most important protection in Anglo-American constitutional law for ordinary people against government abuse. The Constitution gives you the right to remain silent, so if the prosecution wants to investigate you, they have to find the evidence themselves. They can't force you to hand them the knife. So, based on the Fifth Amendment, Fauci's legal team advised him not to say a word, no matter what. The main reason is to avoid perjury charges and legal traps. In his opening statement, Fauci said that Senator Paul has publicly declared for years that he wants to put him in jail. Fauci and his legal team concluded that the real purpose of this hearing wasn't to let Fauci explain himself, but to lure him into speaking. As long as he answers, Senator Paul can take any line from those 1,600 pages of diaries and emails and compare it word for word with what he says today. Even the slightest difference in wording should be used to accuse him of perjury before Congress or of obstructing a congressional investigation and bring criminal charges against him. So, say nothing at all. Then why won't Fauci even answer dumb questions like what day of the week it is? Because when it comes to the Fifth Amendment, there's also a principle of consistency. Simply put, if you invoke the Fifth Amendment, you have to use it for everything or not use it at all. During the hearing, if Fauci answers even a few questions, the judge might decide that he has partially waived his Fifth Amendment protection. So after that, he would have to answer all the remaining questions. That's why his lawyer advised him to respond with the exact same phrase from start to finish, even if they ask him what color his tie is. But attentive viewers must have noticed, what exactly is Senator Hawley talking about here?
Well, nothing says honesty like taking the Fifth, huh, Doc? Let's try some. What day of the week is it today?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color tie are you wearing?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
What color is the carpet in front of you?
On the advice of counsel, I respectfully decline to answer based upon my rights under the Fifth Amendment to the Constitution.
Let's just get one thing straight. You don't have any rights under the Fifth Amendment because you've been pardoned, as you very well know, as the Supreme Court has been clear for a century and more. Brown versus Walker, 1896. When he has been pardoned, he may not stand upon his privilege. You know that. Your lawyer sitting behind you now, shifting nervously in their chairs, they know it. This isn't about the Constitution. This isn't about the law. This is about contempt. Contempt for this body and contempt for the American people.
Missouri Senator Josh Hawley is a Yale Law School graduate specializing in constitutional law. His argument is this: Fauci, you were already preemptively pardoned by Biden. In the early hours of January 20th, 2025, just a few hours before leaving office, Biden issued a special pardon that covered all potential federal crimes committed by Fauci from January 1st, 2014 to January 2025. In other words, Fauci simply can't go to jail for anything that happened during that period. So since there's no longer any risk of you going to jail, in theory, the protection of the Fifth Amendment should automatically be withdrawn. This logic actually has precedent. It's from the Supreme Court case Brown versus Walker in 1896. That case was about a railroad company auditor who was subpoenaed to testify before a grand jury. He was afraid he might say something incriminating and get prosecuted, so he invoked the Fifth Amendment and refused to answer. But at that time, Congress had passed a law called the 1893 Immunity Act, which stated that any testimony given by a person at that hearing could absolutely not be used by the federal government to prosecute that person. This is known in law as statutory immunity. But Brown still felt that this wasn't safe enough, so he continued to refuse to speak. As a result, he was detained by Sheriff Walker. So Brown took Walker to the Supreme Court, but the Supreme Court ultimately ruled against him by a vote of 5-4. The reason was that the statutory immunity granted by Congress is, in terms of legal effect, equivalent to a pardon. Since the government has already, by law, taken away the possibility of prosecuting you, your criminal risk naturally drops to zero. Once that criminal risk disappears, your Fifth Amendment protection automatically becomes invalid, so you have to speak. Back then, Brown received statutory immunity from Congress, while today, Fauci has received a preemptive pardon from former President Biden. The sources are different, but in terms of legal effect, both shield them from the risk of being convicted in court. So why is Fauci still able to invoke the Fifth Amendment? This is the most exciting part of this legal battle of wits. Listen up, everyone. On one side, you have the right to remain silent, granted by the Fifth Amendment, and on the other, there's an 1896 Supreme Court case that says if you've been pardoned, you can't keep your mouth shut. So why is Fauci's legal team still having him stay completely silent? The key comes down to two words: perjury risk. A pardon only covers things that happened in the past. It can't protect him from anything he says today. The immunity card Biden gave Fauci covers everything he did between 2014 and 2025. But yesterday was already July 29th, 2026, and Fauci testified after being sworn in, so every word he said was new testimony. For example, if Senator Paul asks him, during that conference call on February 1st, 2020, when you and 12 other scientists discussed the origin of the virus, were your opinions unanimous? If he answers that they were unanimous, but his diary shows that their opinions were not completely aligned, then that would prove he committed perjury in court. If he answers, I don't remember, but there's a whole page in the diary with detailed notes listing who attended and what was said, that proves there's no way he could have forgotten. Oh, that's still perjury. Perjury is a separate federal felony, and it carries the maximum sentence of 5 years in prison. This is a new crime that happened in 2026, and it has absolutely nothing to do with the get-out-of-jail-free card Biden issued last year. That's why, just a couple of days ago, the current Secretary of Health, Robert Kennedy Jr., said on Fox that if he dares to lie one more time, we'll charge him with a new count of perjury. So Senator Hawley is right. Once pardoned, past crimes are gone. But while past crimes are erased, new crimes can happen at any time. So legally speaking, Fauci's silence is defensible. There's still room for argument. Additionally, there is ongoing debate about the constitutional validity and limits of preemptive pardons. With such a broad pardon that hasn't been reviewed by the courts, just how far does its protection actually extend? In theory, this is a federal level pardon, so does that mean lawsuits in state courts can also be pardoned? If Fauci's ever caught committing perjury, then if he's prosecuted in various states, he would still face potential legal risks. And because of these potential legal risks, Fauci is not completely and absolutely immune from judicial conviction, which leads to the conclusion that his legal team ensures he cannot be deprived of his right to remain silent under the Fifth Amendment of the Constitution. This brings up a profound question. If a defendant remains silent from start to finish, what does that actually mean within the framework of American constitutional design? When the founding fathers of the United States designed the Fifth Amendment, their original intention was to protect innocent, ordinary people from being forced to confess. However, the same Constitution also establishes the congressional hearing system, which requires witnesses to tell the truth before Congress. These two principles are supposed to stay out of each other's way. You have the right to remain silent, and I have the right to hold you accountable. It's rare for both rights to come into direct conflict at the same time. But this time, these two rights have collided. On one side is Congress's constitutional right to uncover the truth, and on the other is the citizens' constitutional right not to incriminate themselves. When someone, faced with the lesser of two evils, chooses to endure the public shame of silence means consent just to keep their mouth shut and protect themselves, then all the questions they didn't answer on the record, the answers are already written in that silence. Someone who truly has a clear conscience has no need to invoke the Fifth Amendment at all. So, what will happen next? Will Fauci be held accountable for what he has done? Before the hearing ended, Senator Paul said, "Next week I will call a committee vote to decide whether to hold you in contempt of Congress." Although contempt of Congress is only a misdemeanor under U.S. federal law, the maximum penalty is up to 1 year in prison and a $100,000 fine. Trump's former advisor Steve Bannon and former trade advisor Peter Navarro were both convicted of contempt of Congress for refusing to cooperate with congressional investigations, and they actually served 4 months in federal prison. Of course, from the committee vote to the full Senate vote, then to the Department of Justice filing charges, and finally a court conviction, there are still several hurdles in between. Whether the Senate can overcome a lengthy filibuster and pass it is still uncertain. But that doesn't mean Fauci can just sit back and relax. The signals coming from the Trump administration are already very clear. Whether it's through contempt of Congress or new perjury charges, this historic reckoning against America's godfather of the pandemic is just getting started. This time, there's no way Fauci will get away unscathed. For now, he's built a high wall with constitutional privileges, temporarily holding the line in front of him. But his 110 refusals to answer have also shown the world just how absurdly far he's willing to go to ruin his own reputation at the end of his career. And the core of this century's biggest mystery, we still haven't even touched it yet. Why did Fauci end up where he is today? Does he actually have any real connection to the gain-of-function research at the Wuhan Institute of Virology? Did the massive federal funding from the NIH actually end up through indirect channels in the lab of the Batwoman, Xi Zhengli? Did the virus really leak from the Wuhan Institute of Virology? How many lives is Fauci responsible for? These are the real questions the senators wanted to ask but couldn't. In the next episode, I want to do a complete expose, tracing everything from Fauci's funding of gain-of-function research in the 2000s to the connections between the Wuhan Institute of Virology and Fauci through intermediaries like Peter Daszak of EcoHealth Alliance, then to the outbreak at the end of 2019 and the systematic cover-up by the Biden administration after 2020. I'll try to connect every hidden thread, every key moment, every suspicious federal grant, and every crucial player involved in secret deals and lay out a full chain of evidence right in front of you, explaining it all clearly. If you're interested in this kind of content, please leave me a comment below and let me know you want to hear more. I'll plan future episodes based on how interested everyone is. Alright, that's all for today. Thank you all for watching. Before you go, could I ask a small favor? If you haven't given me a like yet, please go ahead and give me a thumbs up now. If you're new here, welcome to True Perspective. Please subscribe and also share my show with more friends. Don't forget about the fan hype feature. Every interaction from you helps my new videos reach a wider audience. With that, I'd like to thank everyone in advance. Alright, thank you all for watching. Let's meet again at the same time this Saturday on True Perspective. See you then. Bye.